After the of my mother, my father started a new family and distanced himself from me. He sold my mother's wedding ring, which was a symbol of her memory. When I left them, they needed my help. I'm Sarah, and I'm 12. Or I guess, for a while, I felt 12 in a world where things mostly made sense. That was before my dad's life and mine took a sharp turn. Everything changed one spring day, just a year after we'd laid my mom to rest. I knew Dad was lonely, but I didn't expect he'd bring someone else into our lives so soon. Her name was Amelia, and she had a daughter, Ellie, who was only 4. Dad introduced us at a family picnic, acting like it was all casual. But deep down, I knew he wanted me to accept Amelia and Ellie right away. It was like he'd made his mind up, and my only choice was to smile along. From the start, I had mixed feelings about Amelia. She was polite and always brought me little gifts, even before we moved in together. But something didn't feel right. She was careful to win over Dad, always with that soft laugh and delicate touch on his arm, as if everything she did was gentle and perfect. Yet, as soon as her eyes landed on me, there was a different look, one that seemed to evaluate, not necessarily welcome. Once Dad and Amelia got married, life at home shifted like sand under my feet. We moved to Amelia's house, which felt huge and empty compared to our cozy home. My room was at the far end of the hall, and Ellie's was right next to Amelia and Dad's. This arrangement felt like the beginning of something I couldn't explain, as if they were a family unit, and I was an extra piece they were unsure of where to fit. The distance wasn't just physical but emotional too. I tried to adjust to our new life, but Amelia's focus was always on Ellie. It was like Ellie was the sun, and we all just orbited around her. Every little thing Ellie did was praised. Her messy drawings covered the fridge, her toys cluttered the living room, and her small victories were celebrated with cookies and hugs. I wanted to believe it was just because she was little, but after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that Amelia's interest in me was shallow. She'd ask me questions about school or my day, but before I could fully answer, she'd be pulled back to Ellie's needs. Things came to a head one evening when Dad was out on a work trip, and it was just me, Amelia, and Ellie in the house. I was doing my homework at the dining table when Ellie decided she wanted to play tea party. Amelia called me over and tried to coax me into playing too, saying, "Sarah, Ellie loves it when you join. She looks up to you." I didn't want to hurt her feelings, so I sat down with them, but Ellie quickly got possessive, pulling Amelia's arm and insisting, "Mommy, only you?" Amelia's response shook me. Instead of gently guiding Ellie, she leaned over and said, "It's okay, sweetie. You're Mommy's special girl." She didn't look at me. She didn't see how I froze. At that moment, I felt like I was watching something fragile inside me crack. It wasn't that Amelia favored Ellie. I'd already known that. It was that I realized she was willing to let me feel like an outsider to make Ellie feel secure. It hurt more than I thought it could. Later, Dad called to check in, asking how things were going. I hesitated but told him everything was fine. He sounded so happy, talking about Amelia like she'd solved all his problems, like her warmth had somehow filled the gaps in his life left by my mom's absence. I didn't want to ruin his happiness, so I kept quiet. After all, Dad was my only family left, the one person I could still count on. But the realization that he might be drifting away, caught up in this new family he was building, made me feel a loneliness I'd never known before. Over time, small things turned into bigger frustrations. I'd asked Dad if we could spend a day together like we used to, just the two of us, but Amelia would always insist Ellie come along. "She adores you, Sarah," she'd say with that warm smile, as if to erase any objections I might have. But I noticed it was never just me and Dad anymore. It was always the family, which meant Amelia and Ellie came too. It felt like Amelia was carefully crafting the image of a perfect, inseparable unit, one where I was just another piece but never the central one. A year had passed since Dad married Amelia, and life hadn't gotten easier for me. If anything, it felt like each day drove a thicker wedge between me and Dad. Amelia's influence was subtle but strong, like a shadow that settled over everything we did. She was polite on the surface, always smiling and acting like she cared. But underneath, there was something calculated in her approach. The home I once shared with Dad now felt like a place where I barely fit in, a strange reminder that no one quite saw me. Then came the news that changed everything. One Sunday, Amelia sat us down in the living room, her face pale, voice trembling as she told us that Ellie's health hadn't been good. She mentioned Ellie's fevers, the bruises that took too long to heal, the constant tiredness. They'd finally taken her for tests, and the results had come in. Ellie had leukemia. My heart felt split down the middle. Despite the distance between us, Ellie was still my stepsister, and I didn't want her to suffer. But at the same time, I was tired of living in her shadow, of Amelia's constant attention on her. And now, with this diagnosis, I could already feel my small piece of Dad's attention slipping even further away. My chest tightened as I watched Amelia cry, her face buried in Dad's shoulder. He held her close, whispering soft words of comfort, reassuring her that everything would be okay. He didn't look my way even once. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of doctors, treatments, and bills that seemed to stack up faster than Amelia and Dad could keep up. Ellie's condition became the center of everything, and every corner of the house was filled with signs of her illness. The living room turned into a mini hospital, with medical supplies, bottles of pills, and stacks of paperwork crowding every surface. Dad barely spoke to me. His life had become a constant effort to support Amelia and Ellie, while I watched from the sidelines, feeling more like a guest in my own home. Then, one evening, Dad asked me to meet him in the study. I hadn't been called into the study since Mom was alive, and it held a strange weight of nostalgia and importance. He closed the door behind us and turned to face me with a solemn look in his eyes, a look I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important," he started, his voice softer than usual. "You know how much we've been struggling with Ellie's treatment costs. It's been a hard time, and we're doing everything we can." I felt a cold sense of dread creeping up my spine, but I nodded, waiting for him to continue. He hesitated, then sighed. "There's something of value that we could use to help cover the medical bills. I know it means a lot to you, but it's the only option left." For a second, I didn't understand, but then his words sank in, and my heart plummeted. "No, not Mom's ring." My voice came out in a strangled whisper. Dad's face was drawn, his eyes filled with guilt, but he didn't back down. "Sarah, please try to understand. Ellie's treatment is expensive, and we're running out of time. This could make all the difference." My mind spun. The ring was the only thing I had left of Mom, a small piece of her that I held onto every night, feeling close to her even though she was gone. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a connection, a memory, a symbol of who she was and the love she had for me and Dad. And now, he was willing to give it up for Ellie, his new family. "I can't believe you would do this," I whispered, fighting back tears. "It's Mom's ring, Dad. How can you just sell it?" He reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, but I pulled away, the hurt and betrayal too deep to ignore. "Sarah, I know it's hard, but sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the ones we love. Ellie needs us now. This is for her life." I couldn't take it. I turned and left the study, tears streaming down my face as I ran to my room. My heart was pounding, each beat reminding me of how alone I was, how the only piece of Mom I had left was slipping away because of a choice Dad made without me. I stayed in my room, clutching the ring tightly in my hand, as if somehow that would keep it from disappearing. A few days later, the inevitable happened. Dad came into my room while I was at school and took the ring. When I came back, my dresser looked empty, hollow, like someone had ripped out a part of me and left a gaping hole in its place. I searched every drawer, every nook and cranny, hoping he'd changed his mind, but it was gone. He'd sold it, just like he said he would. The following weeks passed in a daze. I barely spoke to Dad, and he seemed too caught up in Ellie's treatments to notice. The bond between us, once so strong, felt fractured beyond repair. I wanted to scream, to tell him how much he'd hurt me, but I didn't know if it would make any difference. He'd made his choice, and it wasn't me. As Ellie's condition worsened, Amelia became more frantic, her emotions spilling over into every aspect of our lives. She was angry, frustrated, always on edge, and she took it out on everything around her. Dad spent more time at work to cover the mounting bills, leaving me and Amelia alone in the house. Her once kind smiles turned to sharp glares, as if I were to blame for her daughter's suffering. One night, when I was sitting alone in the living room, she walked in and stopped, just staring at me. Her eyes were cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she'd once pretended to show. "Your father sold that ring for us," she said in a low, bitter tone. "The least you could do is act grateful." I looked up at her, stunned. Grateful? For taking away the only thing I had left of my mom? I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that I would never be grateful for what she'd done to my family, how she'd torn us apart with her presence. But I stayed silent, the words lodged in my throat. As the days went on, I began to realize just how isolated I'd become. Dad was wrapped up in his new family. Amelia was too consumed by Ellie's illness to care about anything else, and I was left to navigate this strange, broken life on my own. The pain of losing Mom's ring was a constant ache, a reminder of everything I'd lost. One night, I found myself sneaking into Dad's study. I stood there in the dim light, staring at the empty desk, feeling the weight of all the memories that room held. It had once been a place where Dad and I would talk for hours, where he'd tell me stories about Mom, where we'd laugh and plan our little adventures. Now, it was just another part of a life that felt foreign to me. I wanted to find something, anything, that would bring me back to the way things were. But as I stood there, I realized that those days were gone, lost in the shadow of Dad's new life. And I didn't know if I'd ever find my way back. After Dad sold Mom's ring, something in me snapped. It was like a part of my heart had been broken beyond repair. I went through each day feeling like a stranger in my own home. Dad barely noticed. He was too busy with work, bills, and Ellie's treatments to see the hurt he'd left behind. He still called me kiddo in that casual way, like everything was fine, but his words had lost their warmth. I'd learned not to expect anything from him, but each time he looked through me instead of at me, the sting of rejection felt sharper. Over time, the distance between us only grew, stretching into an unspoken barrier that neither of us tried to cross. I spent most of my days alone, avoiding Amelia, who now treated me with a cold indifference. Her glances were filled with a sharpness that told me I was nothing more than an afterthought in her life. If she noticed my pain, she didn't care. Or worse, maybe she felt I deserved it. The resentment in the house was palpable, an undercurrent of tension that simmered beneath every interaction. One night, I overheard Amelia and Dad talking in hushed voices in the kitchen. I couldn't make out everything they said, but bits and pieces drifted my way. Words like money, bills, and sacrifices cut through the silence, each one twisting the knife deeper. I knew they were discussing Ellie's treatments and the endless expenses that came with them. The fact that my own needs or feelings weren't even part of the conversation made me feel invisible. Around this time, I started coming up with a plan, my own escape. It felt crazy, maybe even impossible, but I needed something to hold on to, a small hope that I could take control of my own life. I began to save every penny I could find, stashing coins and crumpled bills I'd hidden over the years in a shoebox under my bed. I had no clear idea of where I would go or what I'd do, but I knew that if I stayed, I would disappear into the background, lost in the shadows of Dad's new life. After school, I'd take odd jobs wherever I could find them. I babysat kids in the neighborhood, mowed lawns, and even cleaned Mrs. Hargrove's dusty attic, which was full of boxes and strange knickknacks that left me sneezing for days. I never told anyone about my savings or my plan. It was my secret, my one source of power in a life that felt completely out of my control. As the weeks passed, my relationship with Dad deteriorated further. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was usually about practical things like chores or school. Every now and then, he'd try to bridge the gap, asking if I wanted to spend time together. But his attempts felt hollow, as if he was checking off a box rather than genuinely wanting to reconnect. I always found a way to avoid it, brushing him off with excuses about homework or friends I didn't have. One afternoon, while I was cleaning out the garage, I stumbled upon a box filled with old family photos. I pulled it open, brushing the dust off the worn edges, and inside, I found pictures of Dad, Mom, and me from years ago. We looked so happy, like a real family. There was one photo of Mom and Dad dancing, her head thrown back in laughter, his arms wrapped around her. I felt a pang of longing so strong it nearly took my breath away. This was the life I remembered, the family I'd lost. Then, as I shifted through the photos, I found one of Mom wearing the ring, the same one Dad had sold without a second thought. She looked radiant, her eyes filled with love, the ring glinting softly on her finger. Tears blurred my vision, and I clutched the photo to my chest, wishing I could go back to those days, back to a time when I felt loved and secure. But I couldn't go back. That life was gone, replaced by one where I was a ghost in my own home, drifting through days filled with silence and resentment. The photo became my new treasure, a reminder of the life I once had, a life that had been taken from me piece by piece. I kept it hidden in my room, tucked safely under my mattress, where no one would find it. It was the only thing that felt truly mine. As time went on, my resolve to leave grew stronger. I began to gather supplies in secret, small things I thought I might need: a flashlight, an old map, a notebook, and a worn-out hoodie that still smelled faintly of home. I knew it wasn't much, but each item felt like a step closer to freedom, a small symbol of my determination to break away from a life that had only brought me pain. The days blurred into weeks, each one filled with the same hollow routine. But then, one evening, something happened that shook me to my core. I was in my room, counting my savings, when I heard raised voices downstairs. Amelia was yelling, her voice sharp and filled with anger. She was talking about money again, her frustration spilling out in a torrent of accusations and complaints. I pressed my ear to the door, listening as Dad tried to calm her down, his tone tired and resigned. "Jack, this can't keep going like this. We're drowning in debt, and you're just sitting there, pretending everything's fine." Amelia's voice was laced with bitterness. "I'm doing everything I can, Amelia. I'm working extra hours, selling what we don't need." "Selling what we don't need," she interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What about the things we do need, Jack? What about Ellie's future?" There was a long silence, and I held my breath, waiting for Dad's response. But he said nothing, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Amelia continued to rant, listing off bills and expenses, each word a painful reminder of the financial burden that had consumed our lives. As I listened, a cold realization washed over me. I wasn't just a ghost in my own home. I was a burden, an extra mouth to feed in a life already stretched to its limits. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on my shoulders, and for the first time, I felt truly alone. There was no place for me here, no role for me in this fractured family. I was an afterthought, a reminder of a past Dad was too willing to leave behind. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I would leave, for real this time. I didn't know where I'd go or what I'd do, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that I was part of a family that had no place for me. I'd saved enough to survive, at least for a little while, and that was all I needed. The next morning, I packed my things in silence, careful not to draw attention. I took only what I could carry, leaving behind the fragments of a life that no longer felt like mine. I slipped the photo of Mom into my pocket, the last piece of her I had left, and with a final glance at the empty room, I walked out the door. I didn't look back. 18 came faster than I could have imagined. Each year passed with a quiet resolution in my mind. When the time came, I would leave and build a life of my own, free from the weight of my fractured family. By the time I was ready to graduate high school, I had saved enough to start fresh. The idea of leaving didn't scare me. I was determined, focused on the chance to create a life that was mine alone. And I knew that whatever life I made would be far better than the one I had known in the shadow of Dad's new family. The night before I left, I stood in my small bedroom one last time, gazing at the bare walls, the empty drawers, and the echoes of memories that lingered like faded ghosts. I didn't feel sadness. Instead, there was a sense of relief, as if a weight I'd carried for too long was finally being lifted. I took one last look at the photo of Mom I kept in my pocket, kissed it softly, and whispered, "I'm doing this for us, Mom." The morning of my departure, I walked down the hall and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked older, tired, the creases around his eyes deeper than I remembered. He didn't look up as I entered the room, absorbed in his own thoughts, likely about Ellie and Amelia and the life he had chosen. I cleared my throat, and he finally looked up, his face unreadable. "I'm leaving today, Dad," I said simply, my voice steady. I expected a reaction, some hint of surprise or sadness, but he just nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment as much as I had. "I know," he replied quietly, setting down his coffee. "You're 18 now. You'll want to make your own life." It stung, hearing the resignation in his voice, as if he'd accepted long ago that I was no longer a part of his world. But I forced myself to stay calm, to let the words slip past me without letting them break me. "Yes, I need to go." He didn't say anything, and I didn't wait for him to try. I walked out the door, my bag slung over my shoulder, and stepped into the bright morning light. I was finally free. At first, life on my own was harder than I'd imagined. I found a small, dingy apartment on the edge of town, a tiny studio with cracked walls and a leaky faucet. The rent was cheap, but the place felt like mine. I scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, and hung up the few personal items I had, mostly small trinkets and photos I'd collected over the years. Slowly, the place began to feel like home, like a new beginning I could claim as my own. I got a job working at a nearby cafe, a small, cozy spot run by an elderly woman named Linda. She was kind, with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. She taught me how to make coffee, how to manage the register, and even showed me how to handle the occasional difficult customer with patience and grace. Working with Linda became more than just a job. It was like I'd found a new family, one that accepted me without question or judgment. Each day, I felt a little more confident, a little more capable of standing on my own 2 feet. As time passed, I started to make friends. There was Jenna, a regular at the cafe, who worked as a graphic designer and always brought her sketchbook. She had a loud laugh and a mischievous streak, and she quickly became the sister I'd never had. Then there was Max, a college student who studied late into the night and always ordered the same thing: black coffee, no sugar. He was quiet, introspective, and over time, he and I became close, sharing stories about our lives, our dreams, and our fears. Despite the friendships I was building, I sometimes found myself thinking about Dad. I wondered if he missed me, if he thought about the life we'd once had, the promises he'd made. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I pushed them away. This was my life now, a life I was shaping on my own terms. I was stronger without him, more resilient, and I refused to let the past hold me back. One day, a letter arrived in the mail. I wasn't expecting anything, and the sight of my old address scribbled in Dad's familiar handwriting made my heart skip a beat. I debated throwing it away, pretending it had never come. But curiosity got the best of me, and I tore it open, my hands shaking. The letter was brief, almost formal in tone. "Sarah, I hope you're well. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. Life here is complicated. Ellie's treatments continue, and it's been a tough road for all of us. Amelia sends her regards. If you ever need anything, you know where to find us. Take care, Dad." I read the letter over and over, trying to find some hidden meaning, some sign that he still cared. But the words felt empty, like a hollow echo of the relationship we'd once shared. I folded the letter and tucked it away, deciding that I couldn't let his words distract me from the life I was building. Months turned into years, and I poured myself into my work, taking night classes to pursue a degree in psychology. I wanted to help others, to be there for people who felt alone, the way I had once felt. My studies became my focus, my purpose, and I found a deep satisfaction in knowing I was creating a future for myself, one that wasn't tied to Dad's choices or Amelia's presence. Despite my progress, there were moments when the memories crept in. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the family I wished we could have been, about the life I could have had if things had been different. I thought about Mom, about how she would have loved to see me growing, thriving, and finding my own way. I wondered if she'd be proud of me, of the strength I'd found in the face of so much pain. One evening, as I was closing up the cafe, Jenna asked me if I wanted to grab dinner with her and Max. It was a simple invitation, one I would have accepted without a second thought. But as I stood there, listening to her laughter and feeling the warmth of her friendship, I realized just how much I'd gained. I had friends who cared, a job I loved, and a future I was building with my own hands. I was no longer the lonely girl who felt abandoned. I was someone new, someone strong. I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness, and felt a sense of peace settle over me. I didn't need Dad's approval, didn't need his words or his promises. I was living the life I'd always wanted, a life free from the weight of a broken family, a life filled with hope, resilience, and the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. It had been years since I last heard from Dad. After I left, I'd built a life filled with hard-won stability, a life that felt like it was truly mine. The memories of Dad and his new family became distant, like faded pictures in an old album. I'd worked hard to put the past behind me, to let go of the hurt he'd caused, but every so often, it resurfaced in moments I least expected. A glance at a family walking together in the park, the smell of fresh coffee on a quiet morning, or the sight of an old ring in a shop window. Then one cold, rainy afternoon, as I was finishing up a client call from my new home office, my phone rang. I glanced down at the screen, and my heart skipped. It was an unknown number, but something told me to pick up. With a deep breath, I answered, half expecting it to be a telemarketer. "Sarah?" The voice on the other end was hoarse, tentative. I recognized it immediately. It was Dad. A flood of emotions surged through me. Surprise, anger, confusion. I hadn't heard his voice in years, and hearing him say my name felt like an intrusion into the life I'd worked so hard to create. "Dad," I replied, my voice colder than I intended. What do you want?" There was a pause, and then he sighed. "I know it's been a long time. I didn't know if you'd pick up, honestly, but I had to try. I need your help, Sarah." I braced myself, wondering what could have possibly driven him to reach out after so long. "Help? Why are you calling me now?" It's Lily," he stammered, his voice cracking with something that sounded like desperation. "She's sick again. The cancer came back. It's bad this time, and the treatments they're expensive." I felt a chill run through me. The last time Dad had called on me for Lily's sake, it had cost me the last piece of my mother I had left. And now, after all these years, he was asking again. "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied stiffly, trying to keep my emotions in check. "But why are you coming to me, Dad? You made your choice a long time ago." He hesitated, the silence stretching painfully before he spoke again. "Sarah, please, we don't have anyone else to turn to. Things have been difficult, financially, and we're barely holding on. I know I haven't been there for you. I know I've made mistakes, and I regret them, but Lily's life is on the line." The words stung, and I clenched my fist, trying to keep my voice steady. "Regret, Dad? Is that all you have to say after everything? You regret it?" "Sarah, I'm not trying to make excuses," he said softly. "I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, this is about Lily. She's innocent in all of this." A part of me wanted to feel sympathy, to remember the bond we once had. But the scars he'd left ran too deep. I remembered every moment of feeling abandoned, of being cast aside so easily, and I felt the old pain resurface like it was yesterday. "Why should I help you?" I replied, my voice hardening. "When I needed you, you weren't there. You chose them over me, Dad. You sold Mom's ring. Do you even know what that did to me?" He was silent, and for the first time, I sensed a genuine sadness in his voice when he replied, "I didn't know how much it would hurt you, Sarah. I was desperate. I thought I was doing the right thing for my family, and I wasn't your family." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't care. All the years of buried anger and resentment poured out. I was just some leftover piece from a life you wanted to forget. You didn't care about me, Dad. You cared about your perfect little family with Amelia and Lily. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I'm asking you as a father, please help me save her." I wanted to hang up, to shut him out like he'd done to me for so many years. But something held me back, a glimmer of the love I'd once felt for him, a love that had been buried under layers of pain and betrayal. "I'm sorry too, Dad," I replied, my voice trembling, "but I can't help you. Not without an apology, not without you acknowledging the hurt you caused me. You took away the one thing I had left of Mom, and you never once tried to make things right. You just moved on, like I was nothing." He started to speak, but I cut him off. "I'm done being the one who always has to forgive. You made your choices, Dad. You live with them." I hung up, my hand shaking as I set the phone down. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of years of unresolved anger and disappointment. A part of me wanted to believe he'd change, that he'd finally understand the pain he'd caused. But I couldn't keep hoping for a father who had shown me, time and again, that his choices would never include me. That night, I sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, and I felt a strange sense of closure. I had finally said what I'd been holding in for so many years, and for the first time, I felt truly free from the shadow of my past. The week after I turned down Dad's request was quieter than I'd expected. I didn't hear from him, Alice, or even any mutual connections who might try to act as intermediaries. Part of me hoped, maybe, that Dad had finally accepted my decision and moved on. But deep down, I knew it couldn't be that easy. Then, slowly, the calls started. At first, it was just Alice. She left me a voicemail, her voice coated in that honeyed politeness I'd come to know so well, asking if we could talk about everything. I ignored it, erasing her messages one by one as they came in. I knew exactly what she'd say. She'd twist the situation, appeal to my emotions, make herself sound like the rational, caring stepmother who just wanted what was best for everyone. But I knew better. I'd seen through her carefully polished mask years ago. When I continued to ignore her calls, other numbers started to light up my phone. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, aunts and uncles who'd never shown much interest in my life, and even my grandparents, all suddenly seemed to remember my existence. It was like a small army, each one with their own variation of the same message. "Sarah, your father needs you." One Saturday afternoon, the calls were relentless, so I switched off my phone and left it on my dresser, desperate for some peace. But the silence was short-lived. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I peeked through the peephole and saw a familiar face. Uncle Rob, Dad's older brother, standing with his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady as he waited for me to answer. Reluctantly, I opened the door. "Sarah, it's been too long," he greeted me, stepping forward as if I'd invited him in. He looked around my small apartment, his eyes taking in the mismatched furniture and minimal decor. "Uncle Rob," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "I didn't realize you were in town." "Just here to talk, Sarah," he replied, settling onto my couch without waiting for an invitation. "You know, your father's not in a good place right now." I took a deep breath, sitting down in the armchair opposite him. "I know why you're here, Uncle Rob, and the answer's still the same." He leaned forward, his expression softening. "Sarah, family is family. I know you and Jack had your differences, but he's still your father. And Lily, she's just a kid. She doesn't deserve to suffer because of the past." "Lily's illness isn't my responsibility," I said firmly, feeling a mix of guilt and anger rising in me. "I didn't ask for any of this, and I'm not responsible for bailing Dad out every time things get difficult." Uncle Rob sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sarah, I get it. You're hurt, and maybe Jack didn't handle things well back then, but he's trying to make it right. Can't you at least hear him out?" I shook my head, standing up to show him to the door. "No, Uncle Rob. I already gave him my answer. I'm not going to let myself get pulled back into that mess." After he left, the pressure only intensified. I began receiving letters from my cousins and relatives, some of them heartfelt, others dripping with guilt-laden messages about family loyalty and doing the right thing. I'd scroll through the messages on my phone, my jaw clenched as I read each one. They all seemed to paint me as the villain, the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on her father when he needed her most. One evening, I found myself in a conversation with my grandmother, who was one of the few people I'd always felt close to. She'd always been kind, always treated me with warmth and affection. I hadn't expected her to join the others in pressuring me, but I should have known that Dad and Alice would try every angle. "Sarah," she said, her voice gentle over the phone. "I know this must be difficult for you, dear, but family is family. Jack was a good son, you know. He made mistakes, but he's always loved you. Grandma, if he loved me, he would have shown it. Instead, he chose Alice and Lily over me every single time, I replied, my voice shaking. He sold the last thing I had of Mom's, and he never once apologized. And now, after all these years, he expects me to save him. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then she sighed. Sometimes, we have to forgive, Sarah. Life is too short to hold on to anger. I'm not angry, Grandma, I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. I'm hurt, and I have every right to be. I won't keep sacrificing my happiness for a family that didn't want me when it mattered. The conversation ended with her wishing me well, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. It hurt, knowing I was losing even the support of the few family members I'd held on to. But as painful as it was, I knew I had to stand firm. I couldn't let them guilt me into giving up the life I'd worked so hard to build. A few days later, Alice showed up at my work. I was taking a break, sitting in the back room of the cafe, when one of my coworkers told me there was a woman outside looking for me. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw her standing by the counter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Sarah, she called, her voice carrying a hint of desperation. I took a deep breath and walked over, trying to keep my expression neutral. What are you doing here, Alice? She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I took a step back, keeping the distance between us. I just wanted to talk. You won't return my calls, and I didn't know what else to do. I have nothing to say to you, Alice, I replied, my voice steady but cold. I made my decision. Her face twisted in a mix of frustration and sorrow. Sarah, please. Lily's fighting for her life. She's a child. She doesn't deserve this, and neither did I. I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I didn't deserve to be pushed aside, to be treated like I didn't matter. I didn't deserve to lose my mother's ring because you and Dad wanted to play house with your perfect little family. Alice flinched, her expression momentarily revealing the guilt she'd hidden so well over the years. But she quickly regained her composure, her voice softening. I know you were hurt, Sarah, and I'm sorry if we made you feel that way. But Lily is innocent in all this. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive and help us? I felt a pang of anger flare up, sharper than any I'd felt before. They were all the same, trying to manipulate me with guilt and nostalgia, pretending to care only when it served them. I looked Alice straight in the eye, refusing to let her see any weakness. I have forgiven you, Alice, but that doesn't mean I'm going to sacrifice myself for you. I've moved on, and I won't be pulled back into a life that nearly destroyed me. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving Alice standing alone, the weight of her desperation clinging to the empty space I'd left behind. Over the next few weeks, the messages and calls from family slowly tapered off, each one less frequent than the last. It seemed that even they were beginning to understand that I wouldn't be swayed, that I wouldn't bend to their demands. I'd found my strength, and I refused to let anyone take it from me. And as the noise faded, replaced by the quiet peace of my life, I felt a new sense of freedom, one that wasn't bound by their expectations or demands. I had chosen myself, my happiness, my future. For the first time, I felt truly whole. Months passed, and I thought I'd finally reached a point where my family understood my decision and respected it, even if they couldn't accept it. My life grew quiet, free of the calls, messages, and endless guilt trips. I began to settle deeper into my routines, feeling a new sense of stability and self-assurance that had taken years to build. I was surrounded by people who knew me for who I was, not as an obligation, not as someone to be manipulated. Then, one rainy afternoon, as I was closing up the cafe, I saw him, Dad. He was waiting just outside, his shoulders hunched against the rain, looking older and more worn than I remembered. His face was lined with exhaustion, his clothes soaked through, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But as soon as he looked up and our eyes met, that pity evaporated, replaced by the painful memories of his choices that had cut me out of his life over and over. Sarah, he said softly, stepping toward me as I locked the cafe door. Can we talk? Just for a minute. I paused, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let him stand in the rain as I left. But the other part of me knew that if I didn't face him now, this conversation would haunt me. I took a deep breath, gesturing for him to follow me to a nearby awning where we could at least stay dry. He stood beside me, his gaze heavy, as if he was searching for the right words. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. Sarah, I know things haven't been easy between us, and I know you're angry with me. I understand why, I do. But you're still my daughter, and I can't let go without one more try. I looked at him, feeling the weight of all the years between us, all the unspoken pain and disappointment. Dad, you didn't just make mistakes. You made choices. Choices that hurt me, that told me exactly where I stood in your life. You sold Mom's ring, you ignored me for years, and when I needed you, you turned your back. And now, because things are hard for you, you want me to just come back? He flinched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh. I know I failed you, Sarah. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, but I realize now that I was wrong. I see that I was a coward, choosing the easier path instead of doing what was right by you. The admission caught me off guard, and I felt a small crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. But I knew better than to let his words sway me. It was too little, too late. I appreciate you saying that, Dad, I said, my voice steady. But it doesn't change anything. I've moved on. I've built a life that's finally mine, free from all the pressure, all the manipulation. I'm not that girl anymore, the one who waited for you to care. He reached out, his hand trembling, but I took a step back, shaking my head. No, Dad. This is it. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that we're family when you've made it clear time and again that I was never a part of yours. His shoulders sagged, and I saw the realization settle in his eyes. He looked at me, truly looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. I wish things had been different, Sarah. I really do. Me too, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. But we can't change the past. Goodbye, Dad. With that, I turned and walked away, the final weight of my past falling away as I stepped into the rain. I didn't look back, didn't let myself waver. I had finally drawn the line, choosing myself over the family that had only brought me pain. Part 8. A New Beginning. In the weeks that followed, I felt a newfound lightness, a freedom I hadn't known was possible. I'd spent so much of my life waiting, hoping, wishing for Dad's approval, for a family that would love me unconditionally. But now, I had let that hope go, and in its place, I found a peace that was stronger, more enduring. I began to focus on the people in my life who truly cared. Linda, the cafe owner who had been like a surrogate mother, became even more of a confidant. She'd seen me through my struggles, offered advice, and always seemed to know when I needed a quiet word of encouragement. Jenna, my loud and loyal friend, continued to be a constant presence, always pulling me into new adventures, her laughter filling the empty spaces in my life. One day, as I sat in my apartment, Jenna showed up unannounced, bursting through the door with a wide grin on her face. Guess what, Sarah? I got us tickets to that art festival downtown. You, me, and Max. It'll be amazing. I smiled, letting her excitement wash over me. These small, simple moments with my friends had become my new family. They were there for me, without conditions or expectations, offering me a love that was genuine and unwavering. With them, I felt whole, complete in a way I hadn't known was possible. As the years passed, I continued to build on that foundation, strengthening my friendships and expanding my circle. I met others who shared my values, people who brought joy, laughter, and understanding into my life. Together, we celebrated each other's achievements, supported one another through challenges, and created a bond that felt as strong as family. One summer, Linda decided to retire, passing the cafe down to me. She said she trusted me to keep its spirit alive, to make it a place where people could feel safe and welcome. Taking over the cafe was daunting, but with my friends by my side, I embraced the challenge, pouring my heart and soul into creating a space that reflected the life I'd built. A life filled with warmth, love, and resilience. Over time, the cafe became a gathering place, a second home for my friends and for others who sought comfort and community. I watched as friendships blossomed, laughter filled the air, and people found solace in the simple act of sharing a cup of coffee. And in those moments, I knew I'd found my place in the world, a place where I was no longer haunted by the shadows of my past. Every now and then, I'd think about Dad and the family I'd left behind. I wondered if Lily was all right, if Dad had finally found peace in his life. But those thoughts no longer filled me with pain or regret. Instead, they were like distant memories, pieces of a life I'd outgrown. I wished them well from afar, but I knew I'd made the right choice for myself.